Some of these UFC veterans, let me tell you, are salty as fuck because of the crazy amount of success Alex Periera has had with such a quote-unquote limited skill set. We've seen the likes of Anthony Smith, we've seen the likes of Chris Widemen, and other veterans of the UFC sport, Daniel Cormier a little bit, consistently comment on the fact, Anthony Smith even said that he could beat Alex Periera because of that limited skill set. Chris Widemen has commented on Alex Pereira's limited skill set. And DC, although much more jovial about it, has made the comments repeatedly about the fact that the dude can't wrestle. And it's just interesting because in the generation that these guys were sort of raised in terms of becoming a UFC MMA fighter, MMA champion, the predominant narrative was the fact that you have to be a well-rounded fighter. You have to be able to grapple, you have to be able to wrestle, you have to be good in jiu-jitsu, you have to be able to strike, you have to be able to stand up, you have to work in the clinch, and you have to be well-rounded in all of these areas, because if you're not, somebody's going to come along, expose that weakness, and beat you. Right? That was the narrative that these guys kind of grew up on. And they lived through the era of being a well-rounded martial artist and sort of started to see the beginnings of the specialist MMA fighter. So you have guys like Khabib Nurmagomedov, who should probably never stand and strike with anybody. His striking did get better throughout his career, but he was the first kind of real specialist, in my opinion, where all he did was grapple, take people down, maul them, and that was it, right? You saw Israel Adesanya, kickboxing champion, didn't have much in the way of wrestling. He did have some good takedown defense and things like that, but stand and outstrike his opponents. And he could very well still be the middleweight champion if a guy named Alex Periera and Sean Strickland didn't exist. And so it's interesting that people are commenting on Alex Pereira's success, especially because they're coming from sort of that old veteran mentality where you have to be this well-rounded fighter, whereas Alex Periera has seen people be specialists and be successful. Now, in their defense, in the veterans' defense, we haven't really seen Alex Periera against a decent grappler, right? We just haven't. We saw him against Jan, who can wrestle a little bit, but we haven't seen him against an exceptional grappler. So if we see, him fight someone like Magomed Ankalaev, who, unless he's a fool, should probably go for that takedown and try to grapple with him for 5 rounds. So that could very well test it. But what we're seeing is Alex Periera, black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, what we're seeing in Israel Adesanya, what we're seeing in Khabib, all these different type of things, is they have enough of a skill set in the area where they're weak to allow them to exist in the area where they're strong, right? So you see Alex Periera, basically, when he does get taken down on the few occasions, he has enough skills to essentially keep himself safe on the ground, move himself back to the fence, get back up, and then he's back in the world where he's best, right? On the feet, throwing that crazy left hook with what seems like unlimited KO power. You see the same thing out of Izzy. You saw the same thing out of Izzy. Crazy ability to kind of get out of the clinch, get back to space, and piece up his opponents. With Khabib, you saw a guy who had just enough to keep himself safe on the feet so he could get in, push them back against the fence, and take them down and hold them there, right? And so now I feel like we are in an era of specialists, right? People are going to come with a skill set that is far superior to everybody else in their division, whether it be striking or grappling or whatever the case may be, and have just enough to stop their opponents from getting them to the area where they're weakest, right? And so it's an interesting discussion. By the way, if you haven't already, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. It helps with the YouTube algorithm. It helps grow the channel. And let me know in the comments, do you think we're in an era of specialization, or do you think fighters should still be well-rounded in order to become champion? Because like I said, I think this is what's behind this whole sort of commentary on Alex Periera's success, is people can't fathom the fact that a guy who can't wrestle and who, he's a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but like a lot of people are kind of criticizing that black belt, and that could be just they haven't really seen him grapple. But essentially, like what we've seen when Pereira's been taken down, he kind of keeps things tight, and he does enough just to be able to get back to his feet, right? And so I think a lot of the guys who saw success, you know, back in the day, as they say, people like Anthony Smith, who did end up fighting John Jones for a title, Daniel Cormier, who, like, he hasn't really been hated on Pereira all that much, but he has made several pieces of commentary on the fact that he can't wrestle, right? And then we see now Chris Widemen kind of piling on that. I think we've seen other guys, but I can't remember who said what. But it's because in their era, like I've said this before, they grew up with this notion of being a well-rounded fighter with multiple skill sets, right? But now it seems like we're in the era of the specialist, right? Alex Periera, Khabib Nurmagomedov, Islam Makhachev. Although Islam is pretty well-rounded, comparatively speaking, to Khabib. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this specialization. We're going to see people come from different areas where they're super good, and they're going to know just enough to sort of keep the fight in their world. That's the way I see this going. And so we might see a lot of like old school veterans piling on a lot of different, you know, prospects who come up and accomplish great things just because it's a different environment, right? They don't feel the need to be well-rounded everywhere. They feel like they need to know just enough to keep them out of the place where they're weakest, right? And make it so that they can become champion using only the skill set where they're best. And I think this drives so many people crazy. People like Anthony Smith, people like Chris Widemen, probably a little bit Daniel Cormier, because they spent so much time in areas where they didn't really want to be, where they weren't very comfortable, where they didn't have a lot of talent, right? Like DC's an Olympic wrestler, right? And if somehow, you know, back in his day, people had basically been saying, look, do enough to keep yourself safe, then wrestle. And he did. He wrestled a lot, right? But, you know, if you just remember his last fight against, how the hell am I, Stipe Miocic. Jeez, that was brutal. Sorry, Stipe. If you remember his last fight against Stipe, like his whole plan was to wrestle with Stipe the entire time, right? But he didn't. He ended up just standing and striking. And so I think a lot of these guys are just going to have this sort of almost a little bit of regret, you know, like regret about the fact that they didn't focus their skill set, because now they're seeing the specialists coming in and doing what they do in such a dominant fashion. So to me, these guys are pretty salty. There are probably others out there, and they're salty about the fact that they wasted a bunch of time working on areas where they didn't need to work if they could have just specialized in their area and done enough to keep themselves out of trouble. Now again, I don't know if that would have made a difference in the lives of Chris Widemen, Anthony Smith. Frankly, I didn't follow their careers enough. Maybe it would have made a big difference in DC's life. I don't know. But, I mean, DC's got nothing to kind of look back on and be ashamed of, right? Champ, one of the best to have ever done it at light heavyweight, one of the best to have ever done it at heavyweight. You know, he's a legend, right? But I think it's just this whole, like, old school versus new school mentality, right? That's kind of, these veterans, they came up a certain way. We see the specialists coming up this way, and what they're doing is working. I think there's a little bit of that going on. But I could be completely wrong. This is just, you know, the way I see it. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I want to thank you guys once again for watching, and we'll see you next time.